What's the scariest conspiracy theory about modern medicine? Story 1. In 1987, a federal judge found that the American Medical Association had engaged in a decade-long illegal conspiracy to destroy the chiropractic profession. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a federal court finding with a named plaintiff, named defendants, specific acts documented in evidence, and a verdict that was upheld on appeal. The case began in 1976 when chiropractor Chester Wilk and several colleagues sued the AMA, the American College of Surgeons, the American College of Radiology, and several other medical organizations. The specific allegation that these organizations had coordinated a systematic campaign through their ethics codes, their control over hospital privileges, their influence over insurance coverage determinations, and their public communications to prevent medical doctors from professionally associating with or referring patients to chiropractors, with the explicit goal of eliminating chiropractic as a profession. The internal AMA documents that became available through discovery were specific. A committee on quackery within the AMA had as its stated goal the elimination of chiropractic. Members were explicitly told that the campaign's goal was professional destruction rather than patient protection. The campaign had operated continuously for more than a decade. Judge Susan Getzendonner found that the AMA had violated the Sherman Antitrust Act and issued a permanent injunction requiring the AMA to communicate to its members that they were free to associate professionally with chiropractors. The AMA was not required to endorse chiropractic as effective. The court was clear that legitimate scientific criticism of any medical practice is protected. What it could not do was coordinate economic and professional suppression. The reason this matters as more than chiropractic history is what the internal documents established, that a major medical organization had created a formal internal committee whose purpose was the destruction of a competitor profession, had operated that committee for over a decade, and had framed the campaign publicly as patient protection rather than professional self-interest. That didn't happen in another country or another century. It happened in the 20th century United States and was confirmed by a federal court. Story 2, the Cutter Incident of 1955, is one of the most consequential episodes in the history of vaccine policy, and understanding it honestly requires holding two things simultaneously. The polio vaccine program was one of the greatest public health achievements in history, and the specific failure that produced the Cutter incident was real, serious, and the government's management of it left lasting damage to public trust. In April 1955, Cutter Laboratories in Berkeley, California distributed batches of Salk polio vaccine that contained live, active poliovirus rather than the inactivated virus the manufacturing process was supposed to produce. The failure was in the filtration process. The virus had not been adequately killed before distribution. Children who received the Cutter batches developed polio rather than being protected from it. The consequences were severe and specific. Approximately 40,000 cases of abortive polio, 200 cases of permanent paralysis, and 10 deaths among vaccinees, plus secondary transmission to household contacts and community members. The children who were supposed to be protected became the source of an outbreak. The government's response involved the immediate recall of Cutter vaccines and the suspension of the vaccination program while the manufacturing process was reviewed. It also involved a specific decision about public communication, the details of how many children had been paralyzed, the specific failure mode, and the internal regulatory decision-making that had allowed the batches to be distributed were not communicated to the public in a way that allowed full external accountability. Historian Paul Offit, who has written the definitive account of the incident, argues that the regulatory failure that allowed Cutter's inadequate product to reach the public was real, that the subsequent tightening of manufacturing standards was genuine improvement, and that the incident ultimately made the vaccine supply safer. What the incident also did was establish a template, a serious vaccine safety failure, publicly managed in ways that prioritized the vaccination program's survival over full transparency about the failure itself. The people who distrust vaccine safety institutions today are partly responding to a precedent set in 1955. Story 3 between 1955 and 1963. The polio vaccines administered to millions of people worldwide, both the Salk inactivated vaccine and the Sabin oral vaccine, were produced using kidney cells from rhesus macaque monkeys. In 1960, virologist Bernice Eddy discovered that some of these cell cultures were contaminated with a simian virus 40, or SV40, that had not been identified during the production process. Further research found that SV40 could cause cancer in laboratory animals. This is not a conspiracy theory. The contamination happened. Millions of people received vaccines that contained SV40. The virus is capable of inducing tumors in laboratory animals. These are confirmed facts. What remains genuinely contested is whether the SV40 exposure has had measurable health consequences in the exposed human population. Some researchers have found SV40 DNA in certain human tumors, mesotheliomas, brain tumors, and others, at rates higher than would be expected in an unexposed population. Other researchers have not confirmed these findings or have attributed them to methodological artifacts. The epidemiological studies comparing cancer rates in people born before and after the vaccine contamination was addressed have not shown a clear, consistent signal. The scientific community does not have a consensus that the SV40 contamination caused measurable increases in human cancer. The scientific community also does not have a clean reassurance that it didn't. The research is ongoing and contested. The fringe version of this story extends the genuine uncertainty into a cover-up narrative that government health agencies know the contamination caused significant cancer burden and are suppressing the research to protect vaccine confidence. The specific evidence for active suppression, rather than scientific uncertainty, is not established. The genuine version is alarming enough without the cover-up. Millions of people were injected with an oncogenic animal virus, and the research on what that meant for their health is still being argued about. Story 4, the Flexner Report of 1910, is the document most commonly cited in histories of American medical education as the foundation of the modern medical school system. Abraham Flexner, hired by the Carnegie Foundation with Rockefeller funding, surveyed medical schools across the United States and Canada and recommended the closure of the majority of them, specifically those that didn't meet the standards of the German research university model he considered exemplary. The report's stated goal was quality improvement. Many of the schools it targeted had inadequate facilities, undertrained faculty, and produced graduates whose clinical competence was genuinely questionable. The standardization of American medical education that followed Flexner's recommendations did produce improvements in the quality of medical training. It also closed most of the schools that trained black physicians. Of the 7 black medical schools operating in 1910, only 2 survived the post-Flexner consolidation: Howard University College of Medicine and Meharry Medical College. The other 5 were closed, and their closure occurred simultaneously with the effective exclusion of black students from most newly standardized white medical schools through the operation of existing segregation. The consequences for black medical access were significant and multi-generational. The reduction in black physicians produced healthcare access disparities that contributed to worse health outcomes in black communities through most of the 20th century. Outcomes that researchers have connected to the specific reduction in black medical representation that post-Flexner consolidation produced. Whether the Flexner Report was designed to produce this outcome, whether the racial consequences of standardization were intended, anticipated but accepted, or genuinely unconsidered, is the historical question that researchers still debate. What is documented is the specific outcome and the specific funding structure. A philanthropic network with demonstrated interest in social control of black economic advancement funded a reform whose consequences for black medicine were catastrophic and whose racial dimensions were noted by contemporaries at the time. Story 5, informed consent, is the cornerstone of research ethics, the requirement that human subjects understand what they're participating in and freely choose to participate before any research involving them can proceed. This requirement has been foundational since the Nuremberg Code of 1947 and is implemented through the regulations that govern federally funded research in the United States and through equivalent frameworks internationally. There is a legally valid exception. The exception from informed consent rule, EFIC, sometimes called the emergency exception, allows certain clinical research to proceed without individual informed consent under specific conditions. The research must address a life-threatening situation. The patient must be incapacitated and therefore unable to provide consent at the time of enrollment. A legally authorized representative must be unavailable in the time available. The research must represent the prospect of direct benefit to the patient, and the proposed intervention cannot be withheld pending consent without compromising the research. In practice, this exception has been used in studies of emergency treatments, rapid assessment of different resuscitation protocols, comparison of treatments for traumatic injury, early intervention studies in cardiac arrest. These are contexts where the research question is whether a specific emergency treatment is effective, where the research population is by definition incapacitated, and where waiting for consent is not compatible with the emergency nature of the condition. EFIC does require community consultation. The affected community must be notified that the research is occurring, must have opportunities to object and opt out before the research begins, and families of enrolled patients must be notified as soon as possible. This framework is known to medical researchers and to regulators. It is not widely known to the public. Most people who learn it exists experience a specific discomfort. The idea that there is a legal framework under which research can be performed on their incapacitated body without their advance consent, and that the protection against abuse of this framework is the community notification process rather than individual choice. Story 6: The Blood Factor the 8 Scandal. Pharmaceutical companies kept selling a product they knew could kill in the early 1980s. As the AIDS epidemic was being identified in American same-orientation communities, a parallel catastrophe was unfolding in the hemophilia community that received far less attention, and whose full dimensions took decades to be publicly acknowledged. People with hemophilia A, who lack clotting factor VIII, were treated with a blood product called factor VIII concentrate, a pooled blood product manufactured from plasma donated by thousands of donors, any of whom could contaminate the entire batch. In the early 1980s, before HIV was fully understood, and before testing of blood supply was possible, the plasma pools were not screened for what we now know as HIV. The awareness that something was wrong in the hemophilia community developed gradually from approximately 1981 to 1982. What has since been documented through internal company documents and congressional investigations is that some pharmaceutical companies had information suggesting their plasma pools might be contaminated. Information from their own researchers, from reports of illness in their hemophilia patient populations, and from early AIDS case surveillance, and continued to distribute their products during periods when heat treatment that could have inactivated HIV was technically available, but not yet implemented. The specific companies involved, the specific dates of their internal awareness, and the specific decisions to continue distribution vary in the accounts and have been the subject of litigation in multiple countries. What has been established across multiple investigations, including those by the UK Infected Blood Inquiry, which reported in 2024, is that the contamination, the disease transmission, and the deaths that resulted were not simply tragedies produced by the limits of 1980s medical knowledge. They were partly consequences of decisions made in awareness of risk. Approximately 5,000 people in the United States with hemophilia contracted HIV through contaminated blood products. More than 1,000 of them had died by 2000. Story 7: The Chemical Imbalance Theory's Quiet Retreat. Antidepressants were sold on a story that didn't hold up for approximately 30 years. Beginning in the late 1980s with the commercial launch of SSRIs, the dominant public explanation for how antidepressants work was the serotonin hypothesis, that depression is caused by insufficient serotonin in the brain, and that drugs that increase serotonin levels correct this deficiency. This explanation appeared in pharmaceutical advertising, in patient literature, in clinical consultations, and in media coverage. It was the story most patients were told when they were prescribed antidepressants. In July 2022, a large review published in Molecular Psychiatry examined the evidence for the serotonin hypothesis of depression. The review, led by Joanna Moncrief and colleagues at University College London, analyzed studies covering millions of people and found no consistent evidence that people with depression had lower serotonin levels or serotonin activity than people without depression. The evidence for the serotonin deficiency model, the review concluded, was weak. This was not a fringe publication in an alternative medicine journal. It was a systematic review in a mainstream psychiatric journal, conducted by credentialed researchers using standard evidence review methods. The response from the psychiatric community was complex and somewhat defensive. Several professional bodies pointed out that few contemporary researchers had actually held the simple serotonin deficiency model in its most naive form, that sophisticated researchers understood depression as multifactorial, while simultaneously being reluctant to explain why the simplified narrative had been allowed to dominate patient communication for 30 years. The specific question the review raised, and that professional bodies did not cleanly answer: if the serotonin deficiency model was known among researchers to be an oversimplification, why were patients being given this simplified explanation? And if antidepressants work, which the evidence suggests they do, for many patients, but not through serotonin correction, then the mechanism of action remains genuinely unclear, and patients were given a false certainty about a mechanism that was commercially convenient rather than scientifically established. Story 8: DSM Diagnostic Expansion. The psychiatrist who helped write the manual says it was used to medicalize normal life. Alan Francis is a psychiatrist who chaired the task force that produced the DSM-IV, the fourth edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the American Psychiatric Association's classification system that defines what counts as a diagnosable mental disorder in American psychiatry. He is a credentialed establishment figure in the field he is criticizing. What he has said about the DSM-5, which he did not chair, is worth hearing. Francis has argued in both academic publications and in his 2013 book, Saving Normal, that the DSM-5 expanded diagnostic categories in ways that pathologized normal human variation. That ordinary grief was reclassified in ways that could lead to depression diagnoses, that childhood temperament differences were categorized as disorders, that bereavement was shortened to a period after which sadness became a disease. His specific argument is not that mental illness isn't real or that psychiatric treatment is without benefit. His argument is that diagnostic expansion beyond the genuinely ill serves the pharmaceutical companies that profit from expanding the prescribable population, and that the APA's process for producing diagnostic criteria has been insufficiently insulated from those interests. The specific conflict of interest Francis describes is documented. Pharmaceutical company funding of psychiatric research, of continuing medical education programs for prescribers, and of researchers who serve on DSM committees has been studied and is a real feature of the field's funding landscape. Francis is not arguing against psychiatry. He is arguing that the diagnostic system that defines the scope of psychiatry has been shaped by financial interests in ways that have expanded that scope beyond what clinical evidence justifies, and that the expansion has produced harm through unnecessary treatment and through the stigma of unnecessary diagnosis. That argument, from the person who chaired the DSM-IV, is worth taking seriously, regardless of where you land on specific diagnostic questions. Story 9: The National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. There is a special court that compensates vaccine injuries, and it doesn't get much coverage. The National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program is a real federal program established in 1986 that exists to compensate people who have been harmed by vaccines covered under the program. It is funded by an excise tax on vaccines. Claims are adjudicated in what is informally called the vaccine court. the United States Court of Federal Claims, under procedures that differ significantly from standard civil litigation. The program was established in part to protect vaccine manufacturers from direct tort liability that was discouraging vaccine production in the 1980s. The policy logic was that vaccines are broadly beneficial public health tools that should not be economically unviable because rare adverse events expose manufacturers to unlimited individual liability. The program provides a compensation mechanism for injured individuals while insulating manufacturers. From its establishment through approximately 2023, the program has paid approximately $5 billion in compensation to more than 10,000 individuals. These payments are not admissions that specific vaccines caused specific injuries in every case. The program operates under a more permissive evidentiary standard than civil courts, and some payments represent settlements rather than adjudicated causation findings. The existence of this program and the specific fact of the billions in compensation paid circulates in anti-vaccine communities as evidence that the government knows vaccines regularly cause serious harm and is hiding it through a special court designed to keep compensation out of public view. The honest description is different. The program exists. It has paid significant compensation. The payments reflect a policy decision to compensate injured individuals under a lower evidentiary threshold rather than require them to prove direct causation in civil court. And the specific injuries compensated include both confirmed vaccine adverse events and events for which causation was not definitively established, but compensation was granted anyway. The program's existence is not a conspiracy. Its low public profile, given its significance, is a legitimate observation. Story 10: LASIK complication underreporting. The surgery's complication rate may have been significantly understated for years. LASIK, laser-assisted in situ keratomileusis, is the most commonly performed elective surgery in the United States, with millions of procedures completed annually. The procedure has been marketed for most of its commercial history, with satisfaction rates typically cited in the high 90s and complication rates described as rare. The marketing has been effective. LASIK has become normalized as a routine, low-risk quality of life improvement. In 2017, the FDA held a public hearing to re-examine LASIK outcomes data. The hearing represented something unusual, a systematic examination of whether the outcome data being used to characterize the procedure's risk profile was accurate. What the hearing produced was significant. Dr. Morris Waxler, a former FDA research chief who had overseen the original LASIK approval, testified that the clinical trials used for approval had used non-standard methodologies and that reanalysis suggested complication rates were substantially higher than what was being communicated to patients. Testimony from patients described chronic dry eye, halos, starbursts around lights, double vision, and persistent pain that had not been adequately characterized in the risk disclosure patients received before surgery. The FDA's subsequent patient-reported outcomes with LASIK studies, which used more systematic methodology than previous satisfaction surveys, found that significant percentages of patients who had reported being satisfied with their vision outcomes still reported bothersome symptoms, particularly visual disturbances and dry eye, at rates higher than industry-funded satisfaction surveys had suggested. Whether this represents suppression of complication data or the normal gap between industry-funded satisfaction surveys and more rigorous patient-reported outcome studies is a framing question. The specific finding that complications were more common than patients were being told is supported by the FDA's own research. Story 11: The Radium Girls' Broader Radiation Silence. Industry doctors were telling workers their glowing symptoms were unrelated to radium. The Radium Girls, the dial-painting factory workers who sued U.S. Radium Corporation in the 1920s after developing radiation-induced bone cancers from ingesting radium-tipped brushes, are a documented history covered elsewhere in this collection. Less well known is the industrial medical apparatus that operated around and after that case to manage the liability created by widespread radium industry employment. The corporate response to the Radium Girls case produced a specific mechanism, the industry-funded medical examination of workers showing symptoms, conducted by doctors with explicit or implicit financial relationships with the industry, who documented findings that minimized the apparent connection between radium exposure and worker symptoms. Internal documents from U.S. Radium Corporation show that company leadership had access to research suggesting radium exposure was causing the bone disease affecting their workers years before any public acknowledgement. The doctors who examined affected workers and attributed their symptoms to other causes, to syphilis, to poor nutrition, to pre-existing conditions, were not necessarily conducting deliberate fraud in every case. The medicine of the early 20th century was genuinely less equipped to establish occupational causation than modern occupational medicine. But the specific pattern, industry-funded medical examinations producing conclusions favorable to industry, conducted on workers whose symptoms were consistent with and likely caused by their occupational exposure, is documented and specific. The Radium Girls case produced legal and regulatory precedents that strengthened occupational health protections for American workers. It produced these protections because the workers sued and won despite the industry-funded medical evidence that had been marshaled against them. The specific pattern, industry-funded medicine producing conclusions favorable to industry on questions of occupational harm, did not end with radium. Story 12: The Mammography Screening Controversy. A legitimate scientific fight over whether routine screening does more harm than good mammography screening. The routine X-ray imaging of asymptomatic women to detect breast cancer before it is otherwise detectable is one of the most widely recommended and most publicly promoted cancer prevention interventions in modern medicine. It is also the subject of a genuine, ongoing, unresolved scientific dispute among credentialed epidemiologists about whether the benefit it provides exceeds the harm it causes. The dispute centers on overdiagnosis, the detection and treatment of cancers that would never have caused symptoms or death if not found. A tumor detected by mammography and treated with surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy represents a benefit if it would otherwise have progressed to cause suffering and death. It represents a harm if it would have regressed, remained dormant, or never caused clinically significant disease, because the treatment produces real side effects and the diagnosis produces real psychological distress. The Cochrane Nordic Center, under Peter Gitcha, published analyses concluding that the randomized controlled trial evidence for mammography screening showed that it prevented approximately 1 cancer death per 2,000 women screened over a decade, while leading to overdiagnosis and unnecessary treatment in approximately 10 additional women over the same population. The ratio of prevented deaths to unnecessary treatments was, under this analysis, unfavorable. Major cancer organizations and screening advocacy groups dispute these conclusions, citing different methodologies, different trial selections, and more recent observational data that they argue shows greater benefit. This is a real scientific dispute conducted by credentialed researchers using different methodological approaches to the same data. It is not a fringe controversy. The systematic uncertainty about whether routine mammography screening produces net benefit after decades of widespread implementation is something most women being screened are not told. Story 13: The Hoxsey Suppression Narrative. Herbal cancer clinics were shut down, and the question of why is still debated. Harry Hoxsey was a self-trained herbalist who operated a network of cancer clinics across the United States from the 1920s through the 1950s, treating patients with a proprietary herbal formula he claimed had been used by his family for generations. At his peak, Hoxsey operated the largest network of cancer clinics in the country, with tens of thousands of patients. In 1956, the FDA and AMA coordinated to close his clinics through a combination of court orders and prosecution for practicing medicine without a license. Hoxsey maintained until his death that his treatment was effective, and that the FDA and AMA had shut him down not to protect patients, but to protect the chemotherapy and surgery revenue of established medicine. His story is cited in alternative medicine communities as a paradigmatic example of institutional suppression of effective cancer treatment. The evidence on the Hoxsey formula's effectiveness is genuinely limited rather than definitively negative. No rigorous randomized controlled trial of the formula was ever conducted before or after the clinic closures. Some of the herbal components in the Hoxsey formula, including pokeweed and burdock root, have been found in subsequent research to have in vitro anti-tumor activity, though in vitro activity does not establish clinical efficacy. What is documented is that many of Hoxsey's patients had cancers that were at advanced stages when they came to his clinics, having been told by conventional medicine that nothing more could be done. Whether his patients who survived did so because of the formula, despite it, or because their cancers were of types that occasionally regress spontaneously is not established by the available evidence. The specific claim that the FDA shut down effective cancer treatment to protect chemotherapy revenue is not supported by evidence. The broader question of whether the case against Hoxsey was purely about patient protection or partly about professional territory is legitimately debated. Story 14. The Insulin Patent Betrayal. Frederick Banting sold the patent for $1, and what happened next is its own story. Frederick Banting, Charles Best, and their colleagues discovered insulin in 1921 and produced the first clinical use in a human patient in January 1922. It was one of the most consequential medical discoveries of the 20th century. A death sentence for type 1 diabetics became a manageable chronic condition overnight. Banting sold his share of the insulin patent to the University of Toronto for $1, reportedly stating that the discovery belonged to the world. The other patent holders similarly transferred their rights to the university with the explicit intention that insulin should be broadly accessible rather than controlled for profit. What followed across the subsequent century is a specific story about pharmaceutical economics. The original insulin formulations produced under those 1921 patents are off patent and cannot be patented again. Pharmaceutical companies have responded by developing modified insulin analogs, formulations with different absorption and duration profiles that can be patented. The most widely prescribed insulin products in the United States today are these modified analogs, some of which cost dramatically more than older formulations with similar clinical outcomes for many patients. The fringe version of this story argues that the re-engineering of insulin was driven primarily by the desire to restart patent protection rather than by genuine clinical improvement. The mainstream version acknowledges that analog insulins do have clinical advantages for specific patient populations, while noting that the price differential between analog and older formulations is not fully explained by efficacy differences. What is documented, and not controversial, is that insulin prices in the United States are dramatically higher than in comparable countries, that people have died rationing insulin they couldn't afford, and that Banting's vision of broadly accessible insulin has not been realized for a significant portion of the American population with diabetes. Whether that outcome was engineered or is simply what market pharmaceutical economics produces is the question that the fringe narrative answers too simply, and that mainstream defenders of pharmaceutical pricing tend to avoid directly. Story 15. The Diagnosis Creep Pipeline. A loop between who defines illness and who profits from the definition. The specific concern Alan Francis raised about the DSM-5 has a structural dimension that extends beyond any single diagnostic manual. The question of who decides what counts as a disorder that requires treatment, and whether that decision-making process is adequately insulated from the financial interests of those who profit when the scope of diagnosable and treatable illness expands. The documented structure of the concern: pharmaceutical companies fund research, and researchers who receive pharmaceutical funding serve on committees that determine what conditions are diagnosable and what treatments are indicated. The funding relationships are disclosed in published papers and on committee membership forms, but disclosure is not the same as independence. A 2006 study by Lisa Cosgrove and colleagues found that of the 170 DSM panel members contributing to the DSM-IVTR, 95 had financial ties to pharmaceutical companies, and for the sections on mood disorders and schizophrenia, where pharmacological treatment is most commonly indicated, 100% of the panel members had pharmaceutical industry ties. The feedback loop this creates: researchers funded by companies that sell psychiatric medications determine what counts as a psychiatric disorder requiring treatment, which determines which conditions will be treated with medications that generate revenue for the funding companies. Each turn of the loop is individually defensible. Researchers need funding, companies need research, diagnostic criteria need expert input. The cumulative direction of the loop is consistently toward expanding the diagnosable population. This is not a theory about fraud. It is a documented structural observation about how the decision-making process that determines the scope of psychiatric illness is funded. The specific outcomes, whether diagnostic expansion reflects genuine clinical need or financial incentive, are debated case by case. The structure of the incentive is not debated. It's documented. Story 16, the statin side effect debate, where legitimate conflict of interest concerns end, and the fringe begins. Statins, cholesterol-lowering drugs, are among the most widely prescribed medications in the world, taken by hundreds of millions of people. The clinical trial evidence for their efficacy in reducing cardiovascular events in high-risk patients is substantial and comes from multiple large, well-conducted randomized controlled trials. In the appropriate patient population, statins reduce heart attacks and strokes. This is not seriously contested by credentialed cardiologists. What is contested, and where the line between legitimate scientific debate and fringe theory runs through a genuinely complicated territory, is the question of side effects and who constitutes the appropriate patient population. The most commonly reported side effect of statins is muscle pain, myalgia, which occurs at rates that differ substantially between industry-funded and non-industry-funded studies. Several analyses have found that the rates of muscle pain reported in non-industry-funded studies and in post-marketing surveillance data significantly exceed the rates reported in the pivotal clinical trials that formed the basis for regulatory approval. The legitimate scientific debate about why these rates differ, whether it reflects methodological differences, the healthy volunteer effect in clinical trials, or reporting bias, is genuine and unresolved. The fringe version takes this legitimate concern and extends it to a comprehensive suppression claim that statin side effects are deliberately understated across the research literature through coordinated industry influence, and that the true rate of serious harm from statin use makes the drugs net harmful, even in high-risk patients. This claim goes beyond what the available evidence establishes. What the available evidence does establish is that conflict of interest in cardiovascular research is documented, that some side effect rates differ between funded and unfunded studies, and that the appropriate patient population for preventive statin use is a genuine scientific debate rather than a settled question. Those are legitimate concerns that the fringe version has attached itself to and inflated past what the evidence supports. Story 17, Havana Syndrome, as classified experiment, the theory that the U.S. government was testing on its own diplomats Havana Syndrome. The cluster of neurological symptoms, including disorientation, headache, tinnitus, cognitive difficulties, and what some affected individuals describe as a specific directional pressure or sound, was first reported by American and Canadian diplomatic personnel in Cuba in 2016. It has since been reported by American diplomatic and intelligence personnel in China, Austria, Germany, Georgia, Colombia, and multiple other countries. The cause of Havana Syndrome has been extensively investigated without producing a definitive scientific conclusion. Theories have included pulsed microwave radiation, infrasound, and, from a 2023 report by Intelligence Community Assessment, primarily stress, anxiety, and environmental factors for most cases, with a subset potentially attributable to external energy. The fringe theory that this entry covers is specifically the claim that Havana Syndrome originated as an American classified experiment, that a directed energy technology being tested by a U.S. government program produced the symptoms in diplomats who were not intended targets or who were intentional test subjects. The symptoms, under this framing, weren't caused by a foreign adversary, but by testing infrastructure the U.S. was operating. The specific evidence for this claim is limited and circumstantial. The distribution of cases across multiple countries where the U.S. has significant intelligence presence, the similarities in symptom presentation across geographically dispersed cases that could indicate a common source, and the absence of a confirmed foreign adversary attack despite significant intelligence community investigation. The U.S. government's investigation has not confirmed a foreign-directed energy attack. It also has not confirmed no foreign attack. The open question about what caused these symptoms in credentialed diplomatic and intelligence personnel remains genuinely open, which is exactly the space that the domestic experiment theory occupies. Story 18. The Morgellons Controversy. A contested condition, dismissed patients, and the specific problem of delusional diagnoses. Morgellons disease is a condition described by patients as involving the sensation of crawling, biting, or stinging under the skin, combined with the presence of fibers, threads, or other solid material emerging from skin lesions. It has been reported by thousands of patients, has dedicated advocacy organizations, and has generated research that has not produced a consensus explanation. The mainstream medical view of Morgellons, documented in multiple studies including a large CDC-sponsored investigation published in 2012, is that the symptoms in most cases reflect a delusional disorder, either delusional infestation or a more general somatic symptom disorder. The CDC study found that the fibers identified in Morgellons patients were primarily composed of cellulose, consistent with textile fibers, rather than anything produced biologically or externally introduced. Patient and advocacy group responses to this conclusion have been consistent, that the delusional diagnosis is a dismissal rather than an explanation, that the fibers are real rather than introduced, and that the CDC study's methodology was inadequate to address the questions raised. The specific problem here is epistemological rather than primarily conspiratorial. When a patient population believes they have a physical illness that their treating physicians believe is psychiatric, the dismissal of the physical belief as a symptom of the psychiatric condition creates an unfalsifiable loop. Patient insistence that the condition is physical can be reinterpreted as evidence of the delusional quality of the disorder, rather than as information about the disorder's actual nature. This dynamic of patient populations whose self-reported symptoms are dismissed as delusional by institutional medicine, and who are then unable to access the research that might confirm or refute their experience, is not unique to Morgellons. The condition's fringe associations with bioweapon exposure are the least defensible layer. The institutional dismissal of patient experience is the genuine concern underneath them. Story 19. The root canal systemic disease theory. A century-old dentist's research and the people who still believe it. Weston A. Price was a dentist and researcher who in the early 20th century developed a theory called focal infection. The idea that bacteria trapped in root canal-treated teeth could leak into the bloodstream and cause systemic disease throughout the body, including heart disease, kidney disease, and arthritis. Price conducted what he described as experiments demonstrating that rabbits implanted with extracted teeth developed the same diseases that had affected the human patients who owned the teeth. The focal infection theory was taken seriously in early 20th century medicine. Tonsillectomies, tooth extractions, and other interventions were performed on patients with systemic disease on the theory that removing the focal source of infection would relieve distant disease. By the mid-20th century, the theory had been largely abandoned by mainstream medicine after it failed to withstand rigorous scientific examination. The specific experimental methods Price had used were found to be methodologically flawed, and the clinical evidence for focal infection as a cause of systemic disease did not hold up. Contemporary dentistry and medicine do not support the focal infection theory as Price articulated it. Root canal treatment is considered safe and effective by dental and medical professional bodies. A dedicated alternative health community has maintained Price's research as valid, arguing that mainstream dentistry rejected focal infection theory not because it was wrong, but because root canal treatment is lucrative, and because the evidence contradicted by a century of clinical experience and randomized controlled trials was suppressed. Whether to read Price's research as genuine early science that didn't survive rigorous examination, as research that was rejected for reasons partly related to professional economics, or as something else is a question the specific research record can inform. The general proposition that a tooth can become a reservoir of infection with systemic consequences is not inherently implausible. It's the specific mechanism Price proposed and the scale of effect he attributed to it that are not supported by subsequent research. Story 20, the Framingham Heart Study manipulation claim, was one of the most cited studies selectively interpreted. The Framingham Heart Study, begun in 1948 and continuing today, is one of the most important longitudinal studies in medical history. Following a cohort of residents of Framingham, Massachusetts across generations, it identified cardiovascular risk factors, including elevated blood cholesterol, high blood pressure, smoking, and obesity, that have defined the framework for cardiovascular disease prevention across decades. Its influence on clinical practice has been extraordinary. Cardiovascular guidelines, treatment thresholds, and the entire edifice of preventive cardiology are built substantially on Framingham data. When doctors tell patients that their cholesterol is too high and recommend treatment, the risk estimates underlying that conversation trace substantially back to Framingham. The fringe claim is that the Framingham data has been selectively interpreted to favor cholesterol-lowering interventions, and that the data contains evidence that dietary cholesterol was not the villain that the study's conclusions suggested, that the saturated fat heart disease hypothesis that Framingham was used to support was a specific interpretation of more ambiguous data. There is a legitimate version of this concern. Several serious nutritional epidemiologists have argued that the evidentiary basis for the saturated fat heart disease link has been weaker than its dominance in dietary guidelines suggested, and that the relationship between dietary cholesterol, blood cholesterol, and cardiovascular disease is more complex than 30 years of public health messaging implied. The 2015 removal of dietary cholesterol limits from U.S. dietary guidelines reflected an actual reassessment of the evidence. Whether this represents a legitimate scientific revision or evidence that the original interpretation was manipulated to serve pharmaceutical interests is the question the fringe theory answers too definitively. The legitimate version is, the evidence was more complicated than the guidelines suggested, and the guidelines were slow to update. Story 21, the eyeglass prescription dependency theory, holds that optometrists and ophthalmologists deliberately prescribe slightly stronger corrections than optimal, with the effect of causing the eye's natural accommodation muscles to weaken over time through disuse, which then requires progressively stronger prescriptions, which creates a patient who returns regularly for stronger lenses rather than maintaining or improving their own vision. This theory is widespread enough to have generated significant online discussion and to have produced a cottage industry of alternative vision improvement programs, claiming that glasses weaken eyes and that natural vision can be restored through accommodation exercises. The scientific evidence on this question is more nuanced than either the theory or its dismissal suggests. There is genuine research evidence that the prescription of minus lenses, the lenses used to correct myopia, can, under some conditions, be associated with myopia progression rather than stability. The mechanisms by which the eye's axial length responds to optical correction are an active area of vision science research, and the specific question of whether full correction of myopia accelerates axial elongation relative to undercorrection is not fully settled. What is not supported by the available evidence is the specific version of the theory that requires optometrists to deliberately prescribe stronger corrections than needed as a business strategy. The weaker, more defensible version, that the standard practice of full correction may, in some populations, be associated with faster myopia progression than undercorrection, is an active area of research rather than a conspiracy. The myopia epidemic that has produced dramatically increasing rates of myopia in children and young adults across East Asia and increasingly in Western countries is a genuine public health concern. Its drivers are complex and include time spent indoors, near work, and reduced outdoor exposure, not the prescriptions written for it. Story 22, the BCG vaccine cancer suppression theory, an off-patent vaccine with possible broader benefits and minimal commercial interest in proving it. BCG, Bacillus calmette-guerin, is a tuberculosis vaccine developed in the early 20th century and in widespread global use for over 100 years. It is off-patent, inexpensive to produce, and included in the WHO's list of essential medicines. It is also, unusually for a vaccine, the subject of ongoing research into non-specific immune effects that may extend well beyond tuberculosis protection. The specific evidence of interest, BCG vaccination in early infancy, has been associated in multiple observational studies with reduced overall mortality in vaccinated populations that exceeds what TB protection alone would account for. Studies from West Africa and elsewhere have found that BCG-vaccinated infants have lower mortality from respiratory infections, sepsis, and other causes unrelated to tuberculosis. The mechanism proposed involves BCG training the innate immune system in a way that provides broader protection. Research into BCG's potential broader immune effects has accelerated since the COVID-19 pandemic, when trials examined whether BCG vaccination affected COVID severity. Several credentialed immunologists take the non-specific effects of BCG seriously as a scientific hypothesis. The fringe layer that builds on these legitimate observations, that BCG's potential anti-cancer and broader immune effects have been deliberately under-researched because the vaccine is off-patent and cheap, and because a finding of broadly beneficial effects from a 100-year-old vaccine would undermine the commercial rationale for more expensive targeted interventions. The research funding dynamics are real. A vaccine that is off-patent offers no commercial return to pharmaceutical companies and is therefore not a priority for industry-funded research. Whether this represents suppression or simply the normal workings of a market-driven research system is a definitional question rather than an empirical one. Story 23, the Gerson therapy market protection theory, nutritional cancer treatments, and the question of who decides what gets tested. Max Gerson was a German-American physician who in the 1940s and 1950s developed an intensive dietary protocol for cancer treatment involving large quantities of raw fruit and vegetable juices, coffee enemas, and nutritional supplementation. He claimed remarkable results in patients who had been told by conventional medicine that their cancer was untreatable. He testified before a U.S. Senate subcommittee in 1946 and brought patient cases he argued demonstrated clinical benefit. The Gerson therapy is not approved by the FDA or endorsed by any mainstream oncology body. The clinical trial evidence for its efficacy is absent. No rigorous randomized controlled trial has been conducted. The specific components of the Gerson protocol, including the coffee enemas, have associated risks that oncology nurses and physicians regularly see in cancer patients who have pursued the therapy. The narrative that persists in alternative medicine communities is that the Gerson therapy and nutritional oncology approaches more broadly have been actively suppressed rather than simply not tested. The argument that testing nutritional interventions that cannot be patented is not financially incentivized for pharmaceutical companies, and that oncology bodies that make treatment recommendation decisions are dominated by physicians with training and financial relationships in pharmacological treatment. The research funding point is real in the same way it is for BCG. Unpatentable interventions are not commercially attractive to industry funders. The regulatory pathway for approving a dietary protocol as a cancer treatment does not have a clear commercial actor to fund the required trials. Whether this represents suppression or simply the normal operation of a commercially driven research system that produces abundant evidence for profitable interventions and limited evidence for unprofitable ones is the genuinely contested question. The fringe version answers it by imputing active malice. The systematic reality is arguably concerning without requiring that. Story 24, the xenotransplantation secrecy theory. Pig organ transplants are becoming real science. What was hidden in early trials? Xenotransplantation. The transplantation of organs or cells from one species into another has been an active area of medical research for decades. The transplantation of pig heart valves into humans is an established procedure. The transplantation of whole genetically modified pig hearts into human patients became clinical reality in January 2022, when a patient at the University of Maryland received a genetically modified pig heart and survived for approximately 2 months. The science of xenotransplantation involves significant technical challenges: immune rejection, the potential for transfer of porcine endogenous retroviruses from donor animal to human host, and the physiological differences between pig and human organ function. These challenges have been the subject of extensive published research. The fringe theory in this space that early experimental xenotransplantation trials in the 1990s and early 2000s, some of which were never published, either because of regulatory non-disclosure requirements or because the results were unfavorable, produced concerning findings about cross-species viral transfer or immune complications that were not disclosed to the public or to subsequent research subjects. The specific evidence for this claim is limited. Xenotransplantation research is subject to regulatory oversight from the FDA, which does maintain non-public records for experimental protocols. Whether that regulatory framework has been used to conceal findings that would, if public, have altered the research trajectory is a question the available public record cannot definitively answer. The legitimate concern underlying this fringe theory is the specific biological risk of cross-species viral transfer, a risk that is taken seriously by xenotransplantation researchers and regulators, and is the primary reason that PERV-inactivated pigs have been developed for transplantation. The risk is real and managed. Whether it was ever mismanaged, and the mismanagement hidden, is the specific claim without specific evidence. Story 25: Cochlear Implant Market Theory. The surgery that the deaf community sees as a business decision as much as a medical one, cochlear implants, are electronic devices surgically implanted in the inner ear that can provide a sense of sound to people who are severely deaf or hard of hearing. They are not a cure for deafness. They provide a different kind of hearing experience than natural hearing, one that requires significant learning and rehabilitation, and with outcomes that vary substantially among recipients. They cost approximately $50,000 to $100,000 per device and procedure in the United States, creating a significant commercial market. Within deaf communities, particularly those centered on American Sign Language and deaf culture, cochlear implants have been a site of specific conflict for decades. The deaf community has historically argued that deafness is not a disability requiring correction, but a different sensory experience that carries its own rich culture, language, and community. From this perspective, cochlear implantation of deaf children who cannot consent to the procedure represents a decision made by hearing parents, often advised by hearing medical professionals, to alter a child's identity toward hearing norms. The fringe layer that builds on this genuine cultural and ethical tension that cochlear implant manufacturers and associated medical bodies have actively discouraged research into non-surgical communication technologies, amplification alternatives, and educational approaches that would provide deaf individuals with meaningful options without the implant procedure. In order to protect the commercial market for a lucrative surgery, the research funding dynamics here parallel the broader pattern. Research into a patented, profitable surgical technology receives commercial investment, while research into non-surgical alternatives does not produce equivalent commercial returns. Whether this has produced a research agenda that is actively manipulated to protect implant sales is harder to establish than the structural observation that funding follows commercial interest. The ethical questions about deaf children's autonomy are real. The market dynamics of cochlear implant sales are real. The specific suppression claim is the layer for which specific evidence is absent. Story 26: The Spanish flu was bacterial theory, a minority argument about 1918 that has been misappropriated. The 1918 influenza pandemic killed between 50 and 100 million people worldwide, one of the deadliest infectious events in human history. Its cause was a specific strain of influenza A virus, H1N1, that has been reconstructed from preserved tissue samples and sequenced, and that is confirmed as the primary pathogen. There is a legitimate historical observation that many of the 1918 pandemic deaths, particularly in the particularly lethal second wave, involved bacterial pneumonia, specifically Streptococcus pneumonia and other bacteria that caused secondary infections in lungs already damaged by the primary influenza infection. A 2008 paper in the Journal of Infectious Diseases by David Morens and Anthony Fauci argued that the majority of deaths in the 1918 pandemic were likely caused by bacterial pneumonia rather than directly by the influenza virus. This is an observation about causation at the point of death, that the final killing mechanism in many cases was bacterial rather than viral, not a claim that the pandemic was not influenza. The researchers making this argument were not disputing that the influenza virus initiated the pandemic or that it was the pathogen that drove the explosive spread. The fringe appropriation of this research claims that the 1918 pandemic was fundamentally misattributed to influenza to support influenza vaccine development narratives, that framing it as a viral pandemic served later vaccine development. This misrepresents what the bacterial complication research actually argues and uses a legitimate historical observation about the proximate cause of deaths to make a broader claim about virology and vaccine policy that the research does not support. The legitimate insight that secondary bacterial infections drove much of the 1918 mortality, which has implications for pandemic preparedness planning, is worth understanding on its own terms. Story 27: The Aspartame Approval Controversy. Did political pressure override internal scientist objections? Aspartame was first approved by the FDA in 1974. Then had its approval revoked in 1975 pending further review, then was approved again in 1981. A sequence of regulatory decisions that has been the subject of sustained controversy ever since. The specific controversy: in 1981, the FDA's commissioner, Arthur Hayes, approved aspartame over the objection of a public board of inquiry that had recommended approval be withheld pending further study of a potential link to brain tumors in animal studies. Hayes's approval came after political pressure from the Reagan administration, which was pursuing deregulation and had replaced the previous commissioner who had rejected aspartame. Hayes left the FDA shortly after the approval and took a position at a public relations firm that represented the aspartame manufacturer. These specific facts are documented. The revolving door between regulatory officials and the industries they regulate is a documented structural concern. The 1981 approval process had specific procedural irregularities that have been noted by regulatory historians. Whether the approval was itself wrong, whether aspartame poses health risks that the approval process failed to identify, is a separate question. The FDA, the European Food Safety Authority, and other regulatory bodies have since conducted extensive reviews of aspartame's safety and have maintained that it is safe at regulated exposure levels. A 2023 ARC classification of aspartame as possibly carcinogenic to humans, the weakest classification, applied to many common substances, was accompanied by a separate JECFA assessment that maintained existing acceptable daily intake levels. The regulatory process was irregular. The safety question has received extensive subsequent review. The fringe narrative uses the procedural irregularity as evidence that the safety conclusions themselves are corrupted, which the available evidence does not support. Story 28: The Diagnostic Imaging Profit Loop. When hospitals own the scanner and write the referral guidelines self-referral in medical practice, the referral of patients by physicians to facilities in which they have a financial interest is a documented, studied, and regulated concern in American healthcare. The Stark Law limits certain self-referral arrangements in Medicare and Medicaid contexts. Research on self-referral has consistently found that physician ownership of diagnostic and treatment facilities is associated with increased utilization of those facility services. independent of clinical indicators. The diagnostic imaging version of this concern is specific and documented in peer-reviewed healthcare economics research. Physician-owned imaging facilities show higher imaging rates for patients referred by physician owners than for patients referred by non-owners of comparable clinical status. This differential has been found in multiple studies and is sufficiently established that it has informed regulatory policy. The fringe version of this observation extends it to a claim that hospital systems and physician groups systematically influence clinical guidelines, the formal documents that define when imaging is indicated, through their financial relationships with imaging equipment manufacturers and through the composition of guideline committees, creating a closed loop in which the people who profit from imaging define the clinical criteria for when imaging is needed. The documented version of this concern is real and narrower. Self-referral is associated with increased utilization. Conflict of interest on guideline committees is documented, and imaging utilization in the United States is higher than in comparable healthcare systems, without demonstrably better outcomes in most categories. Whether this constitutes systematic manipulation of clinical criteria or the cumulative effect of individually defensible decisions made by physicians with financial interests is the honest uncertainty. The structural incentives point in one direction. The evidence for deliberate coordination of guideline manipulation is at the anecdote level rather than the systematic documentation level. Story 29. The Controlled Opposition Cancer Charity Theory. Are the biggest cancer research organizations structured to avoid finding causes? The organized cancer charity and research funding ecosystem in the United States and internationally is large, well-funded, and the subject of a persistent criticism from within and outside mainstream oncology, that the research priorities of major cancer organizations weight treatment research substantially over prevention and root cause research, and that this weighting serves the interests of the pharmaceutical and medical device companies that are major funders of and beneficiaries from treatment-focused cancer research. This is not a fringe observation. Former National Cancer Institute Director Vincent DeVita has written critically about the allocation of cancer research funding between treatment and prevention. Cancer epidemiologists routinely note that prevention research is systematically underfunded relative to treatment research. The pink ribbon industrial complex, the commercial ecosystem of breast cancer awareness campaigns, many of which raise money that flows primarily to treatment research, has been criticized by Susan G. Komen's own critics and former insiders for exactly this allocation. The fringe version extends these legitimate funding allocation observations to a specific claim that major cancer charities are deliberately structured as controlled opposition, as organizations whose purpose is to channel public cancer anxiety and charitable giving into research that does not threaten the commercial interests of treatment providers, while creating the appearance of comprehensive cancer research effort. The legitimate version of this concern is the observation that treatment research is commercially rewarded in ways that prevention research is not, that this creates systematic research funding skew, and that the people who make funding decisions within large cancer organizations have institutional relationships with treatment-focused research that produce consistent funding preferences. Whether those preferences are the result of coordination, institutional inertia, or the normal operation of commercially influenced science is the honest uncertainty. The controlled opposition framing imputes deliberate design where systematic incentive may be sufficient explanation. Story 30. The long-term corticosteroid harm downplay theory. A drug that's easy to prescribe and expensive to stop corticosteroids, including prednisone, dexamethasone, and their relatives, are among the most widely prescribed medications in medicine, used to suppress inflammation and immune response in conditions ranging from asthma and allergic reactions to autoimmune diseases and certain cancers. They work reliably, they work quickly, and they are available as generic medications at low cost. These features make them attractive first-line treatments for a wide range of conditions. The long-term adverse effects of corticosteroid use are also well established in the medical literature. Bone density loss leading to osteoporosis and fractures, adrenal suppression that can make stopping the drugs difficult or dangerous, increased susceptibility to infection, metabolic effects including blood sugar elevation and weight gain, skin thinning, and psychiatric effects including mood disturbance and psychosis at high doses. The specific fringe theory in this space is that awareness of the long-term adverse effects of corticosteroids was systematically minimized in patient communication to preserve these drugs' role as a convenient, cheap first-line treatment, that the harm profile was known to the medical community well before it was communicated to patients, and that the slow diffusion of harm information into patient-facing communication reflected pharmaceutical industry interests in keeping these inexpensive generics in widespread use rather than more expensive alternatives. The documented version is more limited. Patient communication about corticosteroid adverse effects has historically been inadequate. The guidelines for tapering patients off long-term steroids and managing adrenal suppression have evolved as evidence accumulated, and the specific harms of long-term corticosteroid use were well established in the research literature before they were consistently communicated to patients. Whether this reflects deliberate suppression or the normal slow diffusion of research evidence into clinical practice is the honest uncertainty. It is also a genuinely important patient safety question, regardless of which explanation is correct. Story 31: The Nuremberg Code Loophole Theory. Were research ethics frameworks written with escape hatches. The Nuremberg Code of 1947 established 10 principles for ethical medical research, produced directly from the trials of German physicians for their concentration camp experimentation. It has been the foundational document of research ethics ever since, its first and most cited principle being the absolute requirement of voluntary consent. The subsequent decades of research ethics development, the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, the Belmont Report in 1979, the federal regulations that govern research in the United States, built on and refined the Nuremberg Code's principles. They also created exceptions, qualifications, and categories of permissible research that the original Nuremberg Code did not include. The specific exceptions that the fringe theory treats as deliberate loopholes include the exception from informed consent for emergency research, research in populations including prisoners and psychiatric patients that has been shown to have proceeded under conditions of questionable voluntariness long after formal ethics frameworks were in place, and the category of minimal risk research that can proceed under expedited or waived review. The documented history of research ethics violations after the Nuremberg Code is real. The radiation experiments on prisoners and psychiatric patients that were exposed in the 1990s, the continuation of the Tuskegee study until 1972, and numerous other post-Nuremberg violations were conducted under the formal existence of the Nuremberg Code and subsequent ethics frameworks. The fringe version of the loophole theory treats these violations as evidence that the ethics frameworks were deliberately constructed to permit the research they were supposed to prevent. The more parsimonious explanation, that ethics frameworks are imperfect constraints that institutions with power find ways around, is equally consistent with the historical record and requires no design intent. Story 32: The Cell Tower Cancer Cluster Theory. What happens when you try to study proximity affects the question of whether radiofrequency radiation from cellular infrastructure causes health effects, specifically cancer, has been studied extensively, with the largest and most systematic studies finding no consistent association between cell tower proximity and cancer rates in surrounding populations. The fringe theory in this space is more specific than the general cell phones cause cancer claim that has been addressed by extensive research. It claims that localized cancer cluster data near specific cellular infrastructure sites has been excluded from, delayed in, or selectively reported in published research through the influence of telecommunications industry funding on research design, journal editorial decisions, and regulatory review processes. The conflict of interest dimension of this concern is real in the same way it is real in pharmaceutical research. Industry funding of research on industry products is associated with outcomes more favorable to industry in many fields, a finding that is itself documented in peer-reviewed meta-research. Whether this pattern extends to telecommunications-funded research on ARF exposure, is a question that specific research quality analysis can address. Several researchers who have published findings of associations between ARF exposure and biological effects have faced professional criticism and funding difficulties that they have characterized as related to industry influence on the field. The most prominent is Henry Lai at the University of Washington, whose microwave radiation and DNA strand break research in the 1990s produced documented industry-funded efforts to discredit his work, the details of which were obtained through public records requests. The overall epidemiological evidence does not support a causal relationship between cell tower proximity and elevated cancer risk. The documented industry-funded efforts to influence research on ARF exposure and health are real. Story 33, the placebo control ethics claim. Are some trials running placebo arms longer than ethically disclosed? Clinical trials of new medications typically include a placebo control group, participants who receive an inactive treatment, alongside the group receiving the active medication. The ethical framework governing placebo-controlled trials requires that placebo controls be used only when no effective treatment already exists for the condition being studied. If a treatment is known to be effective, withholding it from a control group is considered unethical under the Declaration of Helsinki. The specific fringe claim in this space that some ongoing clinical trials continue placebo arms beyond the point at which interim data has shown clear efficacy of the active treatment, essentially continuing to withhold a demonstrated effective treatment from control group participants to preserve the statistical power of the trial rather than triggering the early stopping protocols that ethics frameworks specify should occur. Early stopping of clinical trials is a documented and contested area of clinical trial methodology. Some clinical trialists argue that early stopping inflates apparent efficacy because trials that are stopped early when results look good tend to show more impressive treatment effects than trials that run to completion. The argument for continuing trials longer despite apparent early efficacy signals has legitimate statistical underpinnings. The fringe claim converts this genuine methodological dispute into a charge of deliberate deception that data safety monitoring boards, which review ongoing trial data and are supposed to trigger stopping when efficacy is established, are failing to trigger stopping when they should because trial sponsors have interests in longer data collection. Data safety monitoring board decisions are made under confidentiality, which makes external evaluation of specific stopping decisions difficult. Whether failures to stop are occurring systematically and at the direction of sponsors is a claim that specific trial records would be needed to evaluate. Story 34, the organ transplant drug dependency theory. Are immunosuppressant regimens broader than they need to be? Organ transplant recipients require immunosuppressant medication to prevent their immune systems from rejecting the transplanted organ. These medications suppress immune function broadly, reducing the body's ability to attack the donor organ, but also reducing its ability to fight infection and, over the long term, increasing cancer risk. They are taken for the life of the transplant, or until the organ fails, or until rejection occurs. The immunosuppression regimens prescribed to transplant patients have evolved significantly over decades, with the introduction of newer agents that target immune function more specifically and with reduced side effects. The trend in transplant medicine has been toward more personalized regimens that minimize unnecessary immunosuppression while maintaining graft survival. The fringe theory in this space, that immunosuppressant regimens have been kept deliberately broader than personalized medicine, would indicate because narrower, personalized regimens based on individual immune monitoring would reduce the volume and duration of medication prescribed. The argument is that the pharmaceutical companies that manufacture these medications have financial interests in maintaining broad, lifelong suppression regimens, rather than supporting the development of monitoring technologies and individualized protocols that would reduce medication burden. The personalized immunosuppression research area is real and active. Researchers are developing monitoring approaches that would allow regimens to be individualized to each patient's immune status and graft characteristics. The commercial dynamics of this research that personalized protocols might reduce total medication use are real. Whether the broader than necessary regimen claim is supported by the clinical evidence, whether current protocols are actually suboptimal relative to what personalized monitoring would achieve, is the empirical question. The fringe version makes this claim more definitively than the research supports. Story 35, the question modern medicine is actually asking. What does it mean that so many of these are real? We've been through 34 stories. The range across them is significant, confirmed antitrust violations, documented contamination events, legitimate scientific controversies, funding structure observations, and theories that attach to real kernels and extend beyond what the evidence supports. What makes this collection specifically uncomfortable is not the fringe theories. The fringe theories, root canal reservoirs causing heart disease, deliberately overprescribed eyeglasses, have limited evidence and their specific claims don't hold up to scrutiny. What's uncomfortable is the Tier 1 content. A federal court confirmed that a major medical organization ran an illegal conspiracy to destroy a competitor profession. Millions of people were injected with an oncogenic monkey virus, and the research on consequences is still contested. A pharmaceutical industry continued distributing blood products after internal awareness of contamination risk, and thousands of people with hemophilia contracted HIV. The approval process for a widely consumed food additive had documented procedural irregularities and a revolving door departure. Research funding structures create systematic incentives that consistently push toward expanding the treatable population and emphasizing treatment over prevention. None of these require a centralized conspiracy. They don't require anyone in a room deciding to harm people. They require institutions with financial interests making decisions that serve those interests. Imperfect regulatory frameworks being gamed by sophisticated actors, and information that would reduce revenue being communicated more slowly than information that would increase it. The question this collection poses is not, is there a conspiracy against your health? It's, what would systematic institutional self-interest look like in a sector where the products affect everyone's body, and where the decisions about what is safe and what is effective are made by people with financial stakes in the outcomes? The answer, from the confirmed cases alone, looks like a lot of what's on this list.